Hi, my name is Medhat Elmasry, and today I'm going to show you how you can create a code-first development application using ASP.NET Core 3.0. So let us start by creating a simple ASP.NET Core application using the command line interface and also VS Code. So I'm going to go into a DOS window and create an application which I'm going to call Hockey. And the reason I'm calling it Hockey is because I'm going to model the following entities. I'm going to have an entity named Team and another entity called Player. Now there will be a one-to-many relationship between team and player, which basically means that you have a 1 to n relationship. So one team can have multiple players. In terms of the properties that will exist in each entity, in the team entity, we probably might want to have a team name, a city, and maybe a province. We can add country. So if we take, for example, our local team, the Canucks, the team name would be the Canucks, the city would be Vancouver, province BC, the country would be Canada. How about the player entity? The player entity would have a player ID, and you can think of that as the jersey number, and we'd have a first name, a last name, and maybe a position. You can add much more properties. We might want to say, for example, when this player joined the NHL, what's the salary cap and this and that, but we want to keep it simple. So, back in our command line interface, we're going to make a directory called Hockey. I'm going to go to that directory and I'll create a new .NET MVC app using local DB, which is SQL Server. So this switch minus ULD means use local DB. And I'm going to use for authentication, individual authentication. And this should create for me an ASP.NET application. I won't run it because everybody knows what this looks like. We're just going to move on. Since we need some support for SQL Server, we might not need to add some packages. So I'm going to add .NET add package Microsoft .entity framework core .design. This is one package I need. So we're going to add this package. Let's hit enter. Okay, that seems to be good. Now, if we're using SQL Server on a Windows machine, that's fine because we can use the local DB. But if we're on a Mac, we might want to use a container. So that's what I'm going to do now. I have the SQL Server image here. Let me look at my Docker images. And you can see here that I have two SQL Server images. So I'm probably going to use this one here. If you want to run a container that uses SQL Server on Windows, this would be the command. If you want to run it on Mac, this would be the command. Now the only difference between these two is In Windows, you need to use double quotes. On the Mac, you need to use single quotes. Otherwise, it won't work. So since I'm on Windows, I'm going to use this command to start my container. And there we go. Now, the thing to remember here is that the default port number in SQL Server is 1433. But I've made my listening port number on the host machine to be 1444 simply because I already have local DB running on my computer and I don't want to create a port conflict. So I must choose a different port number. If you're using SQL Server on Windows, then you don't need to do this. Now let us check what the status of my container is. And you can see that my container has been running for about a minute. Now let me check that my container has SQL Server that's running. So I can use the Azure Data Studio, which you can download. It's free of charge. I have installed it on my machine. And the benefit of this is that it is an application that runs on all the operating systems. Now you can see that I have already created a connection to the database on port 1444. And this is the way you'd set it up. For server, you'd set it up with localhost comma 1444, not localhost colon 1444. This is the way it deals with port numbers. And then the SA user password is this password that I put here. So if I take this and I put it in here, and I say remember password and I connect, it should connect. And there you go, it has connected. So we have a SQL Server that's running and we can connect to it. I'm going to minimize these, close this, and move on. If you go back to the application here, I've opened it up in Visual Studio Code. In Visual Studio Code, if you go to the app settings, you will see that this is set up to talk to SQL Server that runs on your local machine, and specifically local DB. You don't need to use SQL Server on Docker. You can leave this as is. But I have chosen to use SQL Server on Docker, so I'm going to change this connection string. I'm going to delete this and replace it with, so this is what it would look like. The address of the server is the localhost, comma 1444. I've decided to call my database Hockey. The user ID is SA and the password is this. The next thing I want to do is create my two entities. I'm interested in team and player entities. So I'm going to come to the models folder and create two new files. One is going to be called team.cs and the other one is going to be called player.cs. Now for team, I'm going to create a namespace first. So we're going to create a namespace called hockey and dot models, because this resides in the models folder. And I'm going to create a public class here. And I'm going to call this one team. And it's going to have some properties. The first property is team name. And then we said that we want to have city. Let's look at what we decided. We said team name, city, province, and country. So let's create those properties. There is a one-to-many relationship between team and players. And we need to reflect that in our entity. So we're going to create another property And this is going to be a list of players. And we're going to call that players. So this clearly indicates that, sure enough, we have a one-to-many relationship. Another thing we need to do is, according to code first development, the rules that pertain to the primary key is that if you have an entity that has a property called ID, Entity Framework immediately regards that as a primary key. Also, if you have a property composed of the name of the class plus the word ID, then again, it considers that to be a primary key. We have none of the above. So what we need to do is add an annotation here to tell Entity Framework that this is indeed a primary key. So we're going to add this key annotation, and that needs to be resolved. And player, there's at the moment a squiggly underneath it. It's because we haven't really created the player class yet. So let's go to the player class and create that. So we're going to create a namespace called Hockey Models. And we'll create a class here named player. And here we'll add the properties. The first property is going to be the player ID. And according to what I said before, if there's a property that has the name of the class plus the word ID, we don't need to tell it that it's a key, because automatically it considers it to be a key. Let's add the remaining properties. But we need here a foreign key. So the player entity has a property that is a foreign key, that is team name. So it ties to the team entity. So we can add a property here. We can call it team name. This is the foreign key. Typically, when you're developing an application that pertains to a database or involves a database, as a developer, you typically need to have some seed data. So we need to add some dummy data here. So I'm going to add a class here in the data folder, and I'm going to call it seed data. And this seed data has an extension method called seed. And I'm creating here an extension method that belongs to the model builder class. And this method essentially seeds the data in the database. There are two methods in this class. One is called getTeams, that returns a list of team objects, and you can see here that I'm instantiating a bunch of teams. The first one is Canucks, the second one is Sharks, and so on and so forth. I've got 8 of these hockey teams. Now there's another method here called getPlayers, and here I'm instantiating 4 players. For each player, in addition to specifying the ID, the first name, the last name, and the position, I also need to specify the team name, because this is a foreign key. Going back to my extension method, this extension method, it seeds the data using these 2 commands. The first command seeds the team data, the second one seeds the player data. We will create a context that is dedicated to these entities. We're going to create a context called the HockeyContext. So I'm going to come here and in the data folder, I'll create a new file called HockeyContext. And in that HockeyContext, I'm going to add some code. Now, the important things you need to know is my HockeyContext inherits from DB-Context. That's what makes it a HockeyContext. And this is what the constructor looks like. The constructor basically calls the base class and it passes the options. Down here, I'm defining the entities that I want to exist in my database. I'm interested in two entities. The first entity is a DB set of team, and I'm going to call that teams. And the second entity is a DB set of player, and I'm going to call that players. What we have here is where you can add validation to your entities. Now here I'm saying that the team name is required. I could have done that over here. Player entity, I could have come here and said this one is required. But I've chosen to do that in the context. So here in my player entity, I'm saying that team name is required. This is another way to do it. Another name also of specifying the maximum length without going and doing it in the entity is this. You can say, I want my team name to have a maximum length of 30. Now, if I don't have these two lines, the migration that we're going to look at in a moment will create tables in the database by the name of teams and players. It is common practice that when you create tables in a database, you do that using the singular name rather than the plural name. So here I'm saying to the migrator that when you do create for me a table in the database, I want it to be team and not teams. And player, not players. So this is what I have in my context class. Let's close this and go to my startup file. Now in my startup file, I already have a context that's been defined here. The ApplicationDBContext, which uses SQL Server and this connection string. I'm going to copy this and add a similar line for the HockeyContext. And here I'm saying that I have another context called the HockeyContext, which also uses the connection string called default connection and also uses SQL Server. The next thing is we're going to create a migration. You might ask, what the heck is a migration? Well, the migration is the act of getting Entity Framework to look at your model and determine what the model represents and how to create the appropriate artifacts in the database. So when I run the migration, it's going to create for me what we call the Fluid API, which is a bunch of C# commands that essentially creates the tables, the columns, the rows, the indexes, the primary key, and the whole 9 yards. In order to use Entity Framework Migration, you need to install a utility. If you haven't installed this utility called dotnet-ef, you are recommended to execute this command. Since I already have that utility, I'm not going to do this. What I'm going to do is run this command. And this command says, using this dotnet-ef utility, create a migration, which I'm calling M1. Now this M1 can be anything you want it to be. And here I'm saying, use this context. Why do I have to say this? The reason I have to say this is that in my current application, I actually have two contexts. If you look under data, there are here two contexts. There is this ApplicationDBContext, there is the HockeyContext. So you need to specify which context you want the migration to look at. If there was one context then you could pretty much delete this, because it would know which context you're talking about. But we have two contexts here. So here I have to tell it which context I want to use. This switch -o is the output directory. I'm telling it to generate for me the migration commands in this folder. So let us run this. This will take a while because it's actually inspecting your models. When it's done, you will see this message which says, done. To undo this action, use EF migrations remove. So you can potentially reverse what you just did. What happened now? If we go and look under our data folder, you will see that there's a folder called migrations hockey. And it created for me a file that is named after a timestamp followed by the name I gave my migration. And if you remember, I called it M1. Let's open this up and have a look. If you look in here, you'll see that there are two methods. There is an up method and there is a down method. The down method reverses everything. The up method creates all the artifacts that need to be done in the database. This is a create table, and you can notice here the name is team, which is the name I told it to create. And these are all the columns, and this is my primary key. This is the command for creating the player table. And here are all the columns, and you will notice that the player ID has been detected as being the primary key, and it's been specified here as being the identity column, which in SQL Server lingo means it's an auto-generated primary key. This is the foreign key that's being created here, and this is the primary key that's being created. The primary key is player ID. The foreign key is a link between the team name in player to the team name in the team entity. Here is all my dummy data. This data is going to be inserted in the player entity. This data is going to be inserted into the team entity. And here's an index that's being created. So this is called the Fluid API, and it is generated by the migration. At this stage, the database has not been created because these commands have to be executed before the database and all the tables get created. This is the command that I need to execute in order to create my database. Now, when I hit enter at this point, the database will get created, and we will verify that in a minute if we don't get any errors. And here you go. You can see all the create table commands, all the insert row commands, and everything. This is all displayed here. Let's go back and have a peek at our database. Here's my hockey database. Let me see what's in it. You can see now that indeed I have two entities, the player and the team entities. And I have another table that Entity Framework created called EF Migrations History. Now this one helps Entity Framework detect what are the deltas, what are the changes. Why? I may decide that I want to add another column in one of the tables. Whenever I add or subtract from the schema or the model, I need to create another migration. And this table helps Entity Framework determine what the deltas are. Let's go in here and have a look at our players. So here are our players. Okay? Now it did create another column called team name, and I'm not really sure at this stage why it did that. So now that we have our data, why not we create controllers and views in our ASP.NET MVC application? And we know that we can do that using some scaffolding tools that they've given us. Specifically, there's a tool called the .NET ASPNET Codegenerator. Let's use that. So if you haven't already done so, you need to install this tool called the .NET ASPNET CodeGenerator using this command. I already have this, so I don't need to do that. In addition, in every application that involves code generation, you need to add this package. So I'm going to add this package into my current ASP.NET application. I'm going to come here and execute this command to add the code generation package. Now that I have my code generation utility installed, I can create my controllers and views. I need to create two controllers. One I will call the team controllers, and the other one I'll call the players controller. If we analyze any of one of these commands, this basically uses the utility called ASP.NET CodeGenerator to create for us a controller by the name of Teams controller based on the model team, and the database context is going to be the HockeyContext. We want the controllers to be placed in the controllers folder. So this is this switch here. Relative folder path is controllers. And this switch here, UDL, means use default layout. So the player controller command is pretty much the same thing. So let's execute these and see what are going to happen. And let's do the other command here for the players controller. So we have both. So you will notice that so far we even haven't looked at what the application looks like. Let us run our application for the first time. So let's go .NET watch so that it restarts the web server every time there's a change, and then go run here. We can now look at our web application by pointing it to HTTPS localhost 5001. Let's do that. And here we go. This doesn't look any different from what you would have seen if you started this application without doing any extension to it. But we have done some extensions to it. We've added two controllers. We know that we've added a Teams controller, so we can type in Teams here to see the Teams controller. Let's hit enter, and sure enough you can see that it displays all the teams. How about players? And sure enough we can see our players. Let's add teams and players to our menu system. So I'm going to come here and open up my views shared layout.cs.html, and I will copy one of these and paste it twice. One for the teams and the other for the players. The controller that we want to work with is team, and the action method would be index. And for the player, the controller is player. Actually, it would be teams and players. And the action method is index. So let us save this and come over to our application. Go to the root, and here we have privacy and privacy, which is not right because we did not change the name. So let's go back here and change the names of these. So this should say teams and this should say players. Let's save, come back here, refresh. And now we see teams. If I click on teams, I should see my teams. I click on players, I see my players. Now let us add a new team. Off the bat, when you look at this index view, we're missing something, right? Where's the team name? So I must emphasize here that the scaffolder at the moment doesn't do a very good job. It does 90% of the work. You may have to do 10% of the work by massaging whatever you've got there. So let's add in the team's index page, let us add a column called team name, because this doesn't make any sense if you don't know what the team name is. So let's come here. Under views, we're going to go to the team index page. And all we need to do is add a new column called team name. This would be team name. This section is the head section, and down here we have to enter the body section and make this team name. Let's return to our web page, refresh, and there we go. We can see our team name. Let's check out our players. Let me add a new player. So when you come to add a new player, you see first name, last name, position, and team name. Now team name here is a foreign key. So strictly, this should have been a drop-down list. Let's fix that. Let's go to our view under players. And let's have a peek at what the create view looks like. And you will see here that the team name is an input. We need to make it a select. And when you make it a select, you have to populate that select. So there's some work that needs to be done in the players controller. So let's go to the players controller. In the players controller, let's go down to the create action method, which is this one. This is the action method that basically renders the create form. We need to read all the teams and put those teams in a view bag so that we can transfer that data over to the view. So I have a helper method that will help us do that. I'll put that helper method down at the very bottom, which is down here. Now if you look at this helper method reads all the teams, converts that into a select list item list. This is a class that is conducive for populating a select element in the view, because it has two important properties. It's got the text property and it's got the value property. The text and value properties are the team name. And then there's another selected property, and we'll set that to false. So now we can use this helper method and go back to our create action method here and add it to a view bag. And that would look something like this. Now the next thing we need to do is go to our create view, delete this input element here and replace it with a select element, which looks like this. And the name of the field is team name. The items are going to be populated from this view bag that I created over here. And we're going to add one option here that is disabled and selected. Disabled means you can't use it, but it's the selected by default, and it simply says select team. So now if we go back to our web page and go to players, on the main menu click on create, and down here we have a drop down list. So this has been pretty much fixed. So let me enter some dummy data here and choose let's say lightning. So you will see this is the data I entered here. How about if we want to edit? In edit, we have the same problem. This should be a drop-down list. So let us fix that. We need to go back to our action method, but the one that has to do with edit, which will be this one here. And notice that the edit action method that responds to get is the one that creates the form. So we would have to add a view bag here with the same sort of logic. So I can copy this from up here, bring it down to the edit method, and maybe put it right here. And I can also do a similar thing with the view for edit as I had done with the view for create. So let me copy this from my create view, come over to my edit view, and delete this input element. Make some space here, and I will just paste this, but without the option. What this does is it will populate the drop-down list and it will default to the actual value that exists in the database, which you could edit later on. So let's go back to our web page. Let's go to players and edit, and we'll see that there's a drop-down list, and sure enough, lightning has been selected. So I can actually change this to say ducks and change something else like GGGG here, save, and sure enough it has changed this and it's changed that. Let's look at details. Details, everything looks good there. Delete, I can come here and delete. Now there is one thing that I'd like to do to make this application a little bit better. If you look under data, we have two context classes. The first context class here has to do with the identity framework, and this is the context class that we created. I want to eliminate this one and only use one context class. So let's do that. Let's start off by going to the startup.cs. Let's go in here and comment out this line. Let's transfer some of the logic that's in our HockeyContext class to the ApplicationDBContext class. So I'm coming over to this HockeyContext class. Let's open it up and move some of this logic, which is basically the onModelCreating method and these two entities. We're going to move them to the ApplicationDBContext class. So I'm going to copy them from here and come over to my ApplicationDBContext class and paste that logic right in here. So I'm adding an onModelCreating method here and adding my two entities. Now I can delete my HockeyContext class altogether. I don't need it anymore. So there it goes. Let's go to the players controller, and instead of using the HockeyContext, we're going to change this so that it uses the ApplicationDBContext. Let's resolve this and do the same over here. We need to do a similar thing in the Teams controller. So let's go over to the Teams controller, change HockeyContext to ApplicationDBContext. And let's resolve this. Now let us recreate our database. A simple way to do that is to kill my container. So I'm going to go Docker PS to know what the ID of this container is, and then I'll go Docker RM for remove 7C and I'll say -f so it will stop it and kill it. To recreate the container, this is the command docker run, and we looked at that earlier on. I'm going to hit enter here and it should create for me the container. If I go docker ps, it should show that it's running. I'll do that again just to make sure. It's running for 7 seconds, so that's good. The next thing I want to do is go back to my folder here and get rid of my migrations. I will recreate my migrations because I've totally changed the context. So I can come here and delete this folder altogether. Delete permanently. Let us create a new migration. Now, the last time we did a migration, this was the command that we executed. At that time, we had two contexts. We had the ApplicationDBContext and we had the HockeyContext. Now, because we just have one context, we don't really need to use this switch. And the other thing is we could put both our identity framework tables and our hockey tables in the same directory, so maybe we don't even need this hockey folder. So I'm going to execute this command to create a new migration. Let's do that. Now we're getting an error. It says the entity type identity user login requires a primary key to be defined. If you intended to use keyless entity type code has no key. This error doesn't really tell us much, but I know what the problem is. The problem is this. If you go to the ApplicationDBContext in the onModelCreating method, we need to call the base classes onModelCreating method right here. So this is the command that's missing. That's because this class, the ApplicationDBContext class, inherits from the IdentityDBContext, and you need to call the base classes onModelCreating method and pass it the builder. So let's try our migration command again. This time we don't have any errors. The next step is to update the database, and previously this was the command that we used. Now we have only one context, so we don't really need to specify any context. All we need to do is say dotnet-ef database update, and it should create for us the database. You can see that we don't have any errors, and let's do a .NET run. And check out our application to make sure that it's working. So back in our application here, let me go to the root, and then let's click on teams, and we have our teams, we have our players, and everything seems to be working. We consolidated both context classes into one context class. Thank you for coming this far in my video, and I hope to see you again in future videos. Good luck.